the Italians have a word, a derogatory word, for play which does not have that feature, which is that they call it parpuzio, which isn't a word, which is the players do X and Y and X and Y and X and Y. Sooner or later, the GM tells them to do a thing, like roll or draw cards or some damn thing. And you go through the ritual, and the outcome of it all is pretty much whatever the GM says. And the outcome in terms of the session and like plot, if you will, is also whatever the GM says. So really, you're not doing much. You may be very busy. Your hands are busy. You're adding and subtracting numbers. You're, turning left and right. You're doing all sorts of things like that. But really, anything that happens is going to be dictated. Also, a good player is one who catches the signals about what they're supposed to do and delivers it back.
Right.
So under those circumstances, you can see that the description of the fun of play, the description of the satisfaction of play, at least in my experience, becomes a lot more like magical thinking than like a real effect. You're saying you had fun. You're convinced you have fun. You say this is great. We have a great group. But really the satisfaction I'm talking about isn't there. And when you press, the people in question always use the same language. Well, I really just like hanging out with this group of people. Or this is the game we're used to. Or anything of that kind. A very cynical view of this would say that intermittent rewards are more compelling than constant ones. And so in some ways, this is a very, very cynical point of view. You want to have a shitty game in this regard because people will be, but that keeps telling you that it's great, so that people keep trying, and the very intermittent reward that they get is enough to keep them completely fixated on it. I am not quite so cynical. I think a good game is one that actually does have these qualities. Doesn't mean it has to kiss your ass or that your character always has to succeed, because I'm talking about negative effects as well as positive ones. And it also doesn't mean that your characters can't be stonewalled, blocked, or have things happen to them that you don't want. I think that those are often good features of a game. The characters are stonewalled or have things happen to them that the players don't want. I'm not saying that when I say reward, happiness, satisfaction, I'm not saying the absence of those things.
Right.
Okay, so is this kind of getting a little clearer as to this framework? Now when we talk about mechanics design decisions, that's when we say, is this what we want? In some structures of this kind, the difference between the difference between a Desert Eagle 357 Magnum and a Colt 45 would matter a great deal and be very satisfying and very fun to see in play.
Right.
In other structures and answers to those two questions, the distinction between the two of those would be at most fetishy detail, and most of the time simply a pain in the ass distraction, a subroutine that just gets completely up your nose in terms of the effort you had to do to pay attention to it. So therefore, these questions, which are surprisingly difficult for some people at some times, is where it all is. Everything else becomes in service to what we're talking about. When we look at kinfolk, now, which of the in-the-moment mechanics strike you as absolutely crucial? If they're not right in terms of the effort put into them, the knowledge of them at the table, their implementation in terms of outcome, if they're not right, the whole thing falls apart. I can name a couple right now. Can you?
Um, I think that the understanding and being able to execute on the conflict resolution will be important, since there's a lot at stake in winning and losing those. I would imagine understanding the agency you have over your the ability to shift your chance of success and potentially the cost of potential risk or sacrifice would be important.
Let's take a look at the conflict resolution relative to that variable. What I see is that damage and failure have got to hit hard. You don't want to soak damage in this game. If you have a big old soak, why bother with your curse?
Right.
Also, you talked about, a lack of bounce in some things, but perhaps a higher bounce in terms of damage. That way you can't predict how much you're going to take from being hit. See what I mean? But it could be a lot.
Right.
So do you see how that actually puts a lot of bite on the curse thing? I just took a big hit. Or better yet, I just took a little hit. How much do I want to risk that my next hit that I take is also going to be little?
Right.
And therefore, do I want to get my curse rolling a little as part of what I'm doing right now? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
Momentary and slightly terrifying, that is to say, hard to predict adversity is going to matter a lot, because only then will the decision about the curse be brought forward as a very significant feature.
Right.
So that's what I mean. Now that we have this structure in place, we can now look at pieces of that and say, all right, then, the ability to fight, the procedures of fighting and whatever, from a design perspective, are only there so characters can get hurt.
Right.
And potentially slightly unpredictably. So you can't just say, well, I take about this much every time I'm hit. That gives me a good buffer of about 3 or 4 more hits. I'm set. No, you don't know. You could make it through 10 hits with low damage rolls just to spitball a mechanic. Or you could take 1 hit and get taken down.
Right.
Curse or not. You see, that is where the numbers, the statistics, the probabilities start to matter a lot toward the success of your game. It's not generic. There's a difference in this game. Let's say we had a classic damage roll. I'm not suggesting we do. Okay, but just to keep it simple for a second, let's say it's a roll to hit, roll for damage situation. If it were, then I would argue against a bell curve in damage.
You'd want to be, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, you see, but it's not about that I like flat curves better than bell curves. It's about that's what's working here. And then you work backwards a little bit and you say, okay, now how about character creation? Let's go back to what's fixed, etc. Now wait, where do I want some more choice in that? Is tactical thinking going to be part of character creation or not? Or is character creation going to be colorful and everybody's starting from a plateau of basic effectiveness? Either way is good. It's just a question of what you want. In some ways, front-loading strategy into character creation actually diminishes the strategy in the middle of play. Because that's the problem with the whole min-max thing in point systems, is that they've already strategized their character in the beginning, and now that character has no choice but to just repeat the optimal strategy for their build over and over.
Gotcha.
And that's not strategic thinking during play at all. It's a way to dodge out of it. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but sometimes having characters with very minimal differences in effectiveness at the start can lead to really cool, emergent, big, huge troughs and peaks in effectiveness in different places per character.
Right.
So that's an interesting question.
Right.
When we look at a character, do they end up looking very different from one another 3 or 4 sessions down, or very similar to one another 3 or 4 sessions down? In terms of the curse, you've kind of got that down. What about everything else? That's a good question.
Yeah, I'm not married to any one technique. One thing I was going to basically do was give it's kind of a hand wave, but I think it would work fine if I don't think of something better. But the idea would just be like you have those powers. Those powers affect your ability to overcome obstacles and to engage conflicts, and you get 1 extra one every time you complete a session.
Right. That is, for lack of a better word, good enough for government work.
Right.
But I suggest, and even if you come up with the same answer, I suggest that what we need to do is apply the very same logic that I just did toward damage.
Okay.
What kind of character change in terms of basic incremental improvement, what kind actually helps put the bite on the curse decision, even if it's indirect? So getting more powers, is that, you got to think about it. Does that mean that you are getting more effective, therefore you're mitigating the curse problem, because the curse problem is getting a little nastier as you go along? Right? Well, are you kind of putting a buffer there by putting those powers in?
Right.
Or are the powers only more fuel to the fire?
Right.
For in any number of ways, direct or indirect. And if you want to do that, then you would do something like this. You would say something like, you can have it if your curse is now X, Y, or Z. In other words, you've sort of advanced in cursedness. Then you get a power. If not, you don't.
Okay.
But those are very, very different methods of, quote, improvement. And so it might be worthwhile to think about, how does that improvement relate to the curse? Is it a buffer? Is it fuel?
Yeah. I think that I think I needed to consider that, because
there's no answer to it right this second, and it's a late stage play problem too.
Yeah. And the issue is ultimately the thing you said before, I think in the first session and earlier in this one, that the storyteller gets a little more opportunity to be effective in conflicts and to drive the characters into desperate situations. So I want to give them some more tactical choices.
Sure.
But then again, they're both kind of just getting stronger at the same rate. So
well, possibly I mean that's possible that's enjoyable. We'll see. The way that becomes fun is if the tactical options are not just beefier, making the character beefier, but instead allow for crisscrossing effects that actually alter the way fighting is done, alter the way dealing with problems is done.
Right.
This is going to sound a little odd, but one of the games that excels at this, but only if you know it does and play toward it, is 4th edition D&D.
I love 4th edition D&D. You don't got to convince me.
Let's say, it's pretty much almost any level, which is kind of cool, but if you go up to the places where you get a real shift in your powers, like get a new daily power or something like that, the entire landscape of the whole group changes, because so many of the powers are triggered by what somebody else does. So effectively, you're getting a whole new move.
Right.
Or they set up conditions under which a bunch of other stuff happens in some location or group of locations or something like that. And so if players are really thinking about this, if one person can really change up the whole conditions of the encounter and another person changes up the way they or others move through those conditions, quite a lot changes.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, it's not just getting beefier, it's altering the entire decision-making landscape of how they operate together. And so, therefore, when you think about those powers that are added, and if they're merely quantitative, then yes, they're just doing the up thing. But
Yeah.
if they do put in ways to make combat during session 4 look, feel, and literally work differently than combat in session 1,
Right.
there's a place for that. There's a really good place for that. And in fact, having only 4 jumps for that presents a rather nice package of design space that's easily conceived of and easily worked with. 30 levels, one must say, in 4th is a little bit much in terms of trying to keep that factor coherent all the way through.
Yeah.
5 jumps might be a little bit more manageable.
Yeah.
So that's seems like a fair point that I'd like to make. Now that you see this whole cycle and those subroutines and what they're for, then all of a sudden questions like, how do I roll a hit? Are we really talking about rolls to hit? Do I want a fight to be resolved? You talked before. You wanted the fight to have a lot of give and take and up and down and contingent decision making through the course of it. Rather than just being, well, we rolled and I guess we won, so how did we do that? We don't want that right now. So I can think of a couple of games that are worth your while to check out for this. One of which I say it only because I know it so well, because I wrote it, but Circle of Hands is notable for its skirmish nastiness. Particularly burning your own energy, which is the same as your effective hit points, to jump ahead in the sequence.
Gotcha. I haven't read that one yet, so...
And also, the same variable is powering your magic, and almost all the magic can be pumped with more of it. So, in other words, this drawing on the bodily reserves that you're risking at being hit is extremely harsh. So, that's a piece of it. And it means the timing of combat keeps changing up. Who gets to go?
Right.
So there's that. Let me think of a couple others that I didn't write, so that I don't sound like a total self-promoter.
Right.
Well, some of my recommendations are obscure. A game that everybody should know and should play is Zero, published 21 years ago.
Can you give me some more, like the writer or something? Because if I type Zero...
Yeah. The writer is Lester Smith. It was published in 1997 by Archangel Entertainment. And the key to that one is that since it partly inspired Sorcerer's mechanic, you might recognize it, but the idea is everybody rolls, and then you see what order they go in based on the roll. So everybody moves, and then you're like, okay, that gets in first.
Yeah, that's kind of how the current resolution system for Kinfolk is, but yeah.
And so there's that, and then you also have some of the... I'm trying to think about the ones that aren't kind of hand-wavy. There's something weird going on, or interesting going on, with the latest Marvel Superheroes game, which is the one written by Cam Banks and others. Has what looks like a kind of loosey-goosey system, but it's not. Get this. The player who last went chooses who goes next.
That's cool.
And that includes the villains. So it's actually on you to decide whether you're going to force the villain into action so you guys are more reactive, or whether you're dogpiling the villain first. And you would say, well, we should always just dogpile. And the answer is no, the system actually has some very wicked, consequences waiting for you if you do that.
Right.
As I say, it sounds a little hand-wavy, but it turns out, in terms of the way the dice work, because this is one of those games like Carry, where dice are moving from you to the GM to an unnamed pool, back and forth. Mm-hmm. The dice are all moving around the table based on what just happened. So if you guys all dogpile a villain, and it turns out that all the dice just rolled to the GM, which can happen, now you're in for it.
Right.
So stuff like that. Those are some of the there's a number of interesting things that people have done that often go unappreciated as general principles, because you don't have to. You could take that concept and port it quite nicely into a game that's otherwise rather different in terms of raw resolution, and it would still be a valid idea. So, there's a lot of unused principles floating around.
Can you think of any games, let me clarify. I've noticed that in combats or conflicts, a lot that are granular, like I'm kind of aiming for, that a lot of time is taken up by multiple different roles.
You're talking to somebody who's playtesting a version of Champion right now.
Yes. I'd like to talk with you about that sometime, but...
and also the topic we're after is getting ahead of ourselves, because we need to talk about authorities or credibilities or whatever you want to call them, relative to what I call IIEE. So that's what we're getting into now, because as you can see, once you start thinking about these things embedded role in this larger cycle, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I gotta figure out, I gotta try these different things to make the right one. I got it. This is going to be great. And the answer is yes, you are, because now you're designing your resolutions and your initiative and your damage, your crit tables or whatever it is in a proper context. You know that you have your gold standard for what is or isn't right for this game.
Yeah.
And that matters a lot. I don't really want to go too much further. I just kind of wanted to tickle your fancy with, you can see how this shit is going to matter. It's not just going to be, what's the best combat mechanic or any other such silly question. There isn't a best combat mechanic, but there are a whole lot of worse ones.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to cut you off. I know we need to talk about that stuff, but that is really very much another session down.
Okay. I'll look at these two then.
Last thoughts, anything about the phenomenology videos that you may or may not have thought was interesting?
Yeah, I found them pretty valuable. I watched them while I was painting, so I'm going to go and rewatch them and actually take notes. But I thought that I like the way, and I think that it comes out throughout a lot of your talking about game design. The idea that there's not really there's not a right way to play, there's not a right way to design play. There are ways to play and there are ways to design to play. And I kind of like the way that a lot of the times throughout explaining it, it felt like you weren't saying, because it is a phenomenology after all, so you're kind of like describing the play space, like how do different people play, and I found that valuable thinking about design. It actually gave me an idea for a game as I was watching it.
My work here is done. Bye. But that's great. I think a big part of it now is when we get to the design issue, is that all of a sudden the right way and the wrong way for this project becomes incredibly important after all.
Right.
And so doing it, what phenomenology does is it removes all of the responsibilities of loyalty, definitional problems, real role-playing, for example, ridiculous categories, indie, other things like that. We can just remove that set of contexts. And also to get away from the incredibly distracting problem of, and how am I going to package and promote this thing?
Right.
Because you can't answer that question until you really believe in your thing.
Right.
I want to get away from the marketer of Pepsi versus Coke.
Mm-hmm.
And you could take those two marketing teams paid by different people at the moment and just have them switch places per corporation, and nothing would change. I want to get away from that idea of marketing entirely, so that when we do get there, we can actually see what the design is and say, I'm selling that.
Right.
So, all right. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right.
We'll see how it seems.
Yeah. The thing for kinfolk that I'd be really interested in you messing with for next time is the notion of, now you can't like pre-write or pre-script the outcome of a combat, but the range of possibility of what I know. Let me start all over.
Okay.
I want a better image of a genuine conflict situation for our kinfolk. What does it look like? How do we might think a little bit about how we got there, but I'm at the moment really focusing on, once we're there, what's it like? And what circumstances, what variables matter to us in terms of our options. I think that's a pretty big deal, actually. So,
okay.
Yeah.
So would you like me to like write it as a vignette or?
A couple, yeah. Not as entertainment. I'm not interested in glorious prose. I'm much more interested in them as, yes, a short description of any such situation. A phrase that's useful comes from The Mountain Witch, from Tim Kleiner, who said, all conflict is a form of combat. And then his next line is, no, you didn't read that wrong. I don't have it backwards. And so with that idea in mind, as not necessarily something I believe entirely, but as with that idea in mind regardless, take a look at your conflict situations in that context and say, what are they? Imagined and tactical alike. So that would be extremely useful for my topic next time.
Excellent. I will do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I think my brain is either full or empty. Sometimes it's hard to tell which.
Right.
And I hope you had a good time, because this is where I think, once we're through this section, is where we start to say, all right, now it's time to actually put some stuff down on a page, spend some points, roll some dice, see what happens.
Sounds good.